Let's begin with this afternoon's program. The Concrete Sustainability Hub at MIT was created in 2009 and is a leading research hub that includes a team of dedicated researchers and from several departments within MIT to work along with other leaders from academia, industry, and the government to advance concrete and infrastructure science, engineering, and economics. You can see their website on your screen. If you haven't spent time on the CS Hub, I would certainly recommend you do that after Jeremy and Dan's presentations. Don't go there now. We want you to listen to what they have to say, but there's a tremendous amount of research available to you on that website. We are very fortunate to have the executive director of the CS Hub with us today. Dr. Jeremy Gregory is also a research scientist at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT. His presentation today will focus on the various research that provides guidance to agencies on the economically efficient management of pavement systems. Please help me welcome and give your attention to Dr. Jeremy Gregory.
Great, thank you very much. Let me open it up there. Okay. Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here with you, Art. I went to my undergraduate was at Montana State University, so not too far away from you folks. I'm very familiar with that part of the country and enjoy it very much. Today, what I'm going to talk to you about is our research at the MIT Concrete Sustainability Hub about economically efficient management of pavement networks. And the motivation for us to do this work is really that, we're not getting sufficient investment in our road system, and there's all kinds of resources like, I'm sure you hear about the ASCE grades. About a significant portion of our highways are in poor condition, and a big part of that is because of a investment gap. That is basically, the needs that we have are over $2 trillion, whereas the estimated funding, is under $1 trillion. So that's a pretty significant gap. And part of this is that governments are being forced to do more with less. This is showing an article from the New York Times a few years ago that show combined local, state, and federal gas taxes, right, from low to high. And this chart is showing, how gas taxes revenue went down, obviously in the oil crisis in the 70s, but then increased quite a bit, but then is starting to taper off. And it's because most states don't tie their gasoline tax to inflation. And so they're worth less over time. And also as vehicles become more fuel efficient, consumers are using less gas. And that's led to then infrastructure spending being at an all-time low. This chart here is showing infrastructure spending as a percentage of GDP, and it's the lowest it's been in a long time. So this is really led to many different challenges. And in fact, what's interesting is the American Society of Civil Engineers, when they had to come up with one single grand challenge, they said it's that we need to reduce life cycle costs by 50% by 2025. And of course, a couple of years ago, that seemed like a long ways away, but now that we're in 2021, it seems like it's just around the corner. And so this life cycle cost analysis then is going to be a real key element of addressing that funding gap, because obviously we could get more funding to close that gap, or another way is we could just be more efficient and decrease the amount of funding that we need. And so a big part of the research that we're doing is in asset management, because when ASCE talks about solutions to raise the grade, they have some things in here about fixing the trust fund, increasing investment, but this bottom one here basically says we need to use asset management best practices to prioritize projects and improve the conditions, security, and safety of assets while minimizing costs over its entire lifespan. So basically, we just need to use asset management practices to be more efficient. So what I'm going to talk to you about today are some tools that we can use for economically efficient management of pavement networks. The first one is competitive paving prices. The second one is life cycle cost analysis. And the third one is asset management. Okay, and I'll talk about them one at a time, starting with competitive paving prices. And the motivation for this work was really a question that was asked of us by some of our sponsors about whether the presence of competition between material substitutes impacts pavement material prices. And the way that we analyzed this question was doing some statistical analyses using this Oman bid tabs data, which is a database of all kinds of different paving projects from almost all the states, 47 states. It includes, we studied data for 10 years from 2005 to 2015, 300,000 different pay items and about 165,000 different jobs. And we did statistical analyses looking at many different parameters for each project, paving project. So like, what's the quantity of projects that are being used? We call that project size. What's the total amount of spending in the state? You know, what's the market size? Were any price adjustment clauses used, which is a common thing for asphalt? How many bidders were there on a project? And we call that intra-industry competition, so competition within the industry. If we know it's going to concrete, how many concrete different contractors bid on it? That's intra-industry competition, as opposed to inter-industry competition, which is more about competition between asphalt and concrete. And so the proxy for that is what's the dominant market share? And so in most states, that is going to be asphalt. And so what's the percentage spending on that? And we are able to get some data on how much variation that there is across different states. You can see in a lot it's quite dark, meaning that this is showing the 10-year spending, average spending on asphalt across those. In the Midwest, you actually have some lighter colors there. And keep in mind, this is just for DOT related projects, so it doesn't include like municipalities or counties or things like that. And what we found, what we are trying to do in this statistical analysis is look at how do these parameters compare to basically material prices in the state. Well, like statistically, how much are these things driving the prices on both asphalt and concrete? And the results of this statistical model are shown right here, and these are many of the different factors that I mentioned: project size, state market size, you know, intra-industry competition, inter-industry competition. And these bars are basically showing that, you know, if you make changes in this parameter, how much of an impact would that have on asphalt prices and concrete prices? And what you can see is that, you know, project size is a really big determining factor, whereas this market share or inter-industry competition is also a pretty big deal. So that really does have an impact on both asphalt and concrete prices. Then using that statistical model, we can then try and estimate, you know, like basically if a state was spending, we just chose an average of 5% on concrete, and then if we increase this level of concrete market share to 10%, 15%, 20 or 25, how much would that decrease paving material prices, right? So if we increase market share from 5% on concrete to 10%, it would decrease asphalt prices by 3% or concrete by 13%. And so this isn't a specific prediction, it's just saying that statistically, across all the data that we looked at, you know, when we see higher competition, these are the amounts of lower spending that we see on asphalt and concrete, right? Then what we can do is kind of estimate, if you were to implement that increased competition, how much more paving could you do for a fixed budget, right? Because if you lower prices for both asphalt and concrete, that means you have for that amount of money, you can actually do more paving. So if you're at that 5%, then increase it to 10, 15, 20, 25%, you know, for that 25%, you can actually pave more, about 6.5% increase in total paving tonnage. So I don't think it's rocket science, that if you get more competition, you're able to lower prices. What was interesting for us is that the data that we were able to evaluate really bore that out, that in this a paving market, that is something that we see. So competitive paving prices is, one of the first tools that we see for economically efficient management of pavement networks. The second tool is life cycle cost analysis, and you're likely familiar with this. It's a method for evaluating total costs of ownership. And what it allows you to do is, if you have two alternatives, alternative A and alternative B, and this is showing real costs over time, we look at those initial construction costs, but then we also need to look at what are costs associated with rehabilitation that happens in the future. So for example, this alternative A is a higher initial cost, but it is much lower costs that happen in the future. We can sum those up to get the total life cycle costs. In this case, A had higher initial costs, but lower life cycle costs. And we've developed some models that allow you to look at uncertainty in what happens in the future. And that's what I mean by probabilistic. It just means we incorporate uncertainty. And as you can imagine, there are many sources of uncertainty. When it comes to the transportation agency, there's uncertainty in the unit price of inputs and also the quantity of inputs. And then on the agency side, there's also uncertainty on how much you're going to be using in the future, when you're going to be doing different actions, and what are future construction prices. There's also what we call user costs. There are costs associated with traffic delays and fuel loss. So there's uncertainty associated with those things as well. And one of the things that we wanted to look at is how do life cycle cost analysis results change depending on context, like where you are in the country, for example. And so we looked at a wide range of different scenarios, including wet no freeze climate in Florida, a wet freeze climate in Missouri, a dry freeze climate in Colorado, and a dry no freeze climate in Arizona. So we wanted to understand, how do life cycle cost analysis results change depending on location, and also depending on what kind of traffic levels you have on roads, right? So ranging from urban interstate down to rural local streets and highways. And we also looked at a few different framing conditions. So what type of pavement designs are used? Is it asphalt or concrete? Which kind of maintenance schedules, design life, and analysis period? So some of the things that we found is that, the life cycle perspective really matters, and those future costs can be really significant. This is showing the total life cycle cost for a state highway in Florida. What you can see is that out of that life cycle cost, we have initial construction costs here, but those future maintenance and rehabilitation costs are higher than those initial construction costs. So if you're just making decisions based only on this, you're really missing out on what's going to end up being the more significant costs, which is those activities that happen in the future. The other thing we found is that this context really matters. For example, if I take an interstate rigid pavement design in Colorado, you can see the initial costs really dominate the life cycle cost of that pavement. Whereas if we look at a design that has lower traffic, it's still a rigid or concrete design, then the future rehabilitation costs matter more. If we go to a flexible state highway design, you can see that that was the example that I already showed, where the initial costs are more just what I showed, that they're smaller than the rehabilitation costs. Whereas if we look at an interstate, then those initial costs dominate a bit more. So the point here is there's no like single right or wrong answer. It just depends on many different factors. And that's why when people ask, what's better, concrete or asphalt, we're always going to say it depends, because it depends on many of these factors that I mentioned up here. What's the location, traffic level, pavement design, among many other things. The other thing that we find is that, this life cycle perspective can alter what we call the relative competitiveness, like basically what's the lower cost option. So here's two pavement designs where you can compare the initial cost, and so we have A and B here. In this case, B, there's a 17% difference between the two, but when we include those life cycle costs, they're basically about the same, right? So if you're making decisions just based on that initial cost, you know, when you take that life cycle perspective, it could really change which one becomes preferred. I think when it comes to doing life cycle cost analyses, you know, I mentioned the importance of the pavement designs and maintenance and rehabilitation costs. Another big challenge, though, is determining what are the inputs that you're going to use for the cost side. And just to show you how challenging that can be, you know, you can see there's significant variation in these initial construction costs. What this is showing right here is 12 months of bid data from the Caltrans database right here. So we have the unit price of concrete here in dollars per cubic yard, and this is showing, you know, how frequent you see a particular cost in that data throughout the year. So, you know, we clearly have about a median of about, you know, $160 per cubic yard, but there's some that goes down below 100 and a few of these data points that are way above 500, right? So, you know, obviously, as you know, every job is different. There can be different reasons, you know, who knows, there was something specific about these things right here that made them really expensive. But it's important for us to understand what is driving the variation in these costs. And so one of the things, that's where, coming back to the statistical models like the ones that we use for competition, it's important for us to try to capture those drivers of initial cost and variation. And so what we did here is I took all that same data, and now I have the prices here. It's the log of the unit prices, so we can get this line right here. And then, but now I'm plotting them against the quantity used in the project, and it's also a log because we know that gives us this nice line. But clearly what you see is that what probably all of you know, you get lower prices here for projects that use more material. And once again, I don't think that's a big surprise to anyone, but it's often something that's not included in those life cycle cost analyses. And just like I showed before, there are other factors. If we knew, you know, we could do statistical models of how costs vary by region, or maybe by season, you know, particularly in a place like North Dakota, you know, the paving conditions are going to vary depending on the season. So those are all things that we can capture. The other thing is that doing these probabilistic analyses can really provide insight on the relative risks. And what I mean by that, this is not the risk of the project failing or something like that. It's the risk of exceeding a particular cost. And that may be particularly important to some decision makers. So this chart right here is going to be what we call a cumulative distribution plot. And what the way that you read it is, so once again, going back to my A and B alternatives, this shows basically the probability of a cumulative probability of achieving a particular life cycle cost. So what I would say is that, for example, there's a 50% chance of hitting this cost of about $2.5 million, meaning it's 50%, it could be higher, and 50% it could be lower. For this other alternative right here, you can see that 50% number is about $2.75 million, but it has a different curve. And the reason this matters is that, like, for example, if we compared the means or the average, there's about 8 different percent between the two alternatives. But if we said instead, we're going to take what we call like a 90th percentile number, meaning that I have 90% confidence that the cost will not exceed this number, then we get a 15% difference. And so there are different things about this A and B, you know, probably future material costs or timing of the projects that would lend one to have different amounts of uncertainty. So it could be if you just make a decision based on initial cost, you're not really capturing what's the relative risks associated with these. Another way you can use this is basically to say, you know, I really don't want to exceed this budget of $3 million. You could say, well, for alternative B, there's a 10% chance of exceeding that, whereas for alternative A, it's a 30% chance of exceeding that. Now, out of all the LCCAs that we've done, we have a good understanding of what the major drivers are in these. And it's usually initial costs, meaning that there's all kinds of factors we take into uncertainty, but having a better understanding of what that initial cost is likely to be, that's what's really going to drive that uncertainty. And so it's a key input factor. And even though we get a lot of guidance from FHWA on how to do an LCCA, they really don't provide a lot of information on how to properly capture that uncertainty, particularly when it comes to inputs. So, all right. Last topic here is asset management, and that may mean many different things to different people. For us right now, the assets represent all the different pavement lane miles in a pavement network. And FHWA has relatively recently issued some new performance management rules due to the MAP 21 legislation, which is moving ahead for progress in the 21st century. And a big motivation was to try and improve decision making through what they call performance-based planning and programming. And they had a couple key elements they really wanted to see on asset management plans from the state. How are you dealing with life cycle planning, risk management analysis, and what kind of financial plan are you making? and that'll lead me to expand a little bit on this performance-based planning. The way that this performance management process usually works is that states will set targets for their pavement network. You know, what's the percentage of good pavements in your network? What's the percentage of poor pavements in your network? Then they will measure the performance of all those pavements, driving around with vehicles to measure roughness and cracking and things like that. That information then goes into the pavement management system. And then there has to be, a decision about which strategies to implement in order to meet the targets that have been set. But of course, there's a question about which strategies should you use and what should the cost be. And so basically what we want to understand is, how should we allocate the funds that we have to obtain the best performance at the lowest cost? And this gets back to that theme that I mentioned about trying to, how do you do more with less? How do you get the most bang for your buck? And of course, there's many different approaches to allocate funds. This chart here is showing for a range of different pavement segments that have been ordered from lowest to highest according to the pavement condition index. If this is a sort of my made up pavement network, I have some decisions. How do I prioritize which of these segments I'm going to repair? How do I know if I'm going to meet my targets? Which strategies should be used? Should I use many different short-term fixes so I can spread my funds across all of these? Or should I do a few long-term fixes on the worst ones? And this sort of strategy component can be difficult. And so usually what you use is an optimization modeling approach. And that's the performance-based planning that I mentioned. Developing and deciding which strategies you're going to use in order to meet targets. That's what performance-based planning is. So our research, is to try to improve those allocation decisions as a part of this performance-based planning. And the way that it's usually done is that you start with current and historical pavement network data. So if I understand the current condition of my network and I know how it's been deteriorating in the past, I can use that to then develop models to project what would happen to it in the future. What would happen if I didn't do anything? What would happen if I did treatment A versus treatment B? And then I can use that in some modeling approaches to make decisions on how to allocate resources. And so once again, we want to prioritize projects that maximize our performance, but minimize costs because we don't have infinite budget. So this is a challenge for a few different reasons. First of all, the scale of the problem for state pavement network is daunting. There are many different decisions to be made. Which activity do you do? Preservation activity, which are just sort of minor maintenance, overlays, which might be more about like minor rehabilitation, or a major reconstruction or major rehabilitation. So there's all different kind of options. I have many different segments, you know, it could be a mile or a couple miles of pavement. And when do I do it? Do I do it now or do I wait? And so the budget allocation process is how do I allocate a limited set of funds to a certain set of activities that meet my goals, okay? And this is even more of a challenge because there are just thousands of pavement lane miles. There are many different technologies that can be used. I have a fixed budget and I don't exactly know what the future condition is going to be and how much budget I'm going to have. And so developing the best plan is a bit complicated. So we overcome this in our modeling approach by doing two interlinked tasks. One is what we call the segment level decision, and it's kind of like doing a whole bunch of life cycle cost analyses for each segment or, you know, lane mile of pavement. And what's the best preservation, overlay, or reconstruction strategy? And that can include not just one today, but it can include a sequence of them in the future. Then once we've made decisions on that for all the pavements in the network, then we say, okay, given all the funds that we have, which of these should I actually implement to give me the best network performance while still staying within my budget? And so the way it works is, like I said, let's say you take a pavement network, here showing some roads in Iowa where we've had some data, and then we get data from the pavement management system, current and historical pavement network data. We use that to develop models to project how pavements are likely to deteriorate in the future. And then from that, for each segment, we determine what are some of the best preservation, overlay, or reconstruction alternatives. And we do that for all the segments in the network. And then we put all those into our allocation algorithm to determine what's the best set of options across the whole network. So let me give you an example of how this is worked out for us using some models. This is showing the Iowa US route system. So just the US routes within the network, okay? And this is a pavement management system data for them from 2017, about 10,000 lane miles. Obviously a whole bunch of different types of pavement types, asphalt, concrete, and overlays. And what you can see is this is showing the roughness distribution. So from green is low roughness to red is high. And this is showing in Iowa, they use a pavement condition index here, where red is bad or low PCI and green is high, okay? And then what we do is, because we have this modeling platform, we can play around with some sort of what if strategies. We can look at, you know, what if we just use asphalt treatment technologies or concrete or both? We can also look at different types of treatment types, whether it be preservation, overlay, or reconstruction. And sometimes you'll hear me in a little bit talk about short-term strategies, which are just preservations and thin overlays, whereas long-term strategies are thick overlays and reconstructions. And then the other thing that we do is within those analyses, we look at different segment analysis periods. So, like, for example, usually in determining what's best for each segment, you know, a lot of times people will just look like 5 years into the future, which of course doesn't really comprehend enough of what's going to happen to the pavement and its deterioration. So we also look at a longer evaluation period of 10 years. So short term versus long term. Another thing that we account for in our models is quantifying the excess fuel consumption of vehicles caused by pavement design and maintenance. And so we're basically capturing pavement vehicle interaction. And there's two mechanisms that we're capturing. One is pavement deflection, and this mostly applies to really heavy trucks, which create basically a very small indentation in the pavement such that the vehicle is driving up like a very shallow hill. So the stiffer the pavement is, the less pavement deflection matters. The other one is pavement roughness, and this has to do with the shock absorber system of the vehicle. The bumpier it is, the more energy dissipation there is in the shocks of the vehicle, and the more energy that then has to be overcome for that, right? And so there's fuel that's consumed with that. So smoother pavements lower this excess fuel consumption. And I use the word excess fuel consumption because what we're quantifying here is the additional amount or excess amount of fuel that must be consumed to overcome this. So if a vehicle were driving on a perfectly smooth and perfectly rigid pavement, there would be zero excess fuel consumption, even though it's going forward. So what we do in our models is we quantify that amount of deflection and roughness, and then calculate that excess fuel consumption. And then from that, we can calculate additional costs due to excess fuel consumption, and then also environmental impacts, either greenhouse gases or smog pollutants as well. So for right now, we've just been incorporating this pavement roughness. So when you see me in a little bit show greenhouse gas emissions due to the pavement network, it's mostly from this excess fuel consumption. Okay, now that we have that modeling part out of the way, let me tell you about what are the key conclusions that we found, and then I'll show you some results in order to demonstrate that. So we basically, it's important in this performance-based planning and asset management to leverage 4 strategies. One is having sufficient budget. Maybe this isn't a big surprise, but the more money that you have, the better performance that you can get in your network. But 2, it's important to have a mix of pavement types, and I'll demonstrate a little bit why you don't just want to be using concrete or asphalt, but a mixture of both. Similarly, we want to have a mix of short and long-term fixes. You'll see that even though we can address more pavements if we just use short-term fixes, in the end, the deterioration would still be such that we'd have poor network performance. And lastly, we want to have long evaluation periods. A longer-term perspective means that we can better capture the benefits of those. So let me get into these one by one. First, sufficient budget. So as I mentioned, increasing the budget level improves network performance and reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So what this is showing right here is that basically the annual mean, this is a traffic weighted pavement condition index. And so this is basically the measure of network performance. So we want a higher number to represent our overall network health. And this is the projection into the future. And so these different lines right here are showing different budget levels. So for a low budget level, you can see it sort of can maintain the pavement condition, but eventually it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. Whereas if you have a medium, it stays pretty flat. Whereas with the high level, you can definitely maintain it and even improve it a little bit. Similarly, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions over that 20-year time horizon, you can see that the more money you spend leads to lower overall emissions. And that's because you can maintain a smoother pavement network, and that leads to lower excess fuel consumption from the vehicles. Next, if we look at that mixture of pavement types, so what we looked at is first of all an asphalt only strategy, and then a concrete or Portland cement concrete only strategy. Under the asphalt only strategy, that means we tell the model you can only use asphalt technologies in order to improve the pavement in the future. They're relatively less expensive on initial costs. You can maintain more pavement area, but the treatment effects don't really last as long. By contrast, if you just do concrete pavements, they have a higher initial construction cost, but the treatment effects are longer. But because they're more expensive, you can maintain less pavement area. So this once again is that traffic weighted PCI right here. Now this x-axis here is showing for different budget levels to kind of reinforce that point that for more budget, annual budget, you get more benefit. And what this is showing right here, if you the orange and blue are the asphalt or concrete only strategies, whereas you see consistently, regardless of the budget, you get better performance if you're using both that mixture of asphalt and concrete. And similarly, when it comes to the average annual GHG emissions, now we want this to be a lower number is good, lower emissions. And once again, that's where you see the mixture, both the asphalt and concrete, is good. Now let's talk about that mix of fixes. We're going to look at both. I mentioned the short-term strategy, which, as you may remember, was just preservation treatments and thin overlays, whereas the long-term strategy was thick overlays and reconstruction. Once again, on the short-term strategy, if you can maintain more pavement area, but the treatment effects are short. Whereas in the long-term strategy, the treatment effects are long, but you can maintain less pavement area. And so once again, when you use that mix of fixes, regardless of what the budget level is, you get the best performance. And of course, as you invest more, the network performance is going to go up. And similarly with the greenhouse gas emissions, here now where we want lower numbers is better. We see that with that mix of fixes, then you get much better results, lower annual greenhouse gas emissions. Now, moving on to the evaluation period, where, as I mentioned, this is kind of like when you do your life cycle cost analysis for each segment in the network. Do you do a 5-year analysis period or a 10-year analysis period? We call this the segment analysis period. And so under the 5-year analysis period, it ends up preferring short-term treatments, whereas if you go to a 10-year one, you're able to really look at those costs and benefits of longer-term treatments. So that's what ends up being used more. So once again, on the traffic weighted, this is now traffic weighted IRI, because this result shows up a little bit better with this metric. So now we want a lower number here. We can see that with that longer term perspective, the SAP of 10, we get better results. And no big surprise that that's also tied here to these annual greenhouse gas emissions as well. Lower results are better. So once again, to summarize, when it comes to this asset management, we've shown these quantitative results that say it's really important to make sure you have sufficient budget, to have a mix of pavement types, a mix of short and long-term fixes, and longer evaluation periods. And part of the way that I think about this mix of fixes, it's also just like you want diversification in your stock portfolio, you want diversification in your assets. And I mentioned how we account for uncertainty in many of these things. It just means that when prices in one material are relatively high, it's easy to then pivot and transition to another material. And so that diversification based on the uncertainty over time really helps. But the benefits of all these things then increase with higher budgets. So looking to the future of asset management, data analysis is really a big thing. DOTs have always been tracking data. FHWA is asking them to be more rigorous about reporting it. And thanks to that, we have quite a bit of data that we can analyze, but we found that this data analysis can be really challenging. And this right here is showing normalized roughness, or that International Roughness Index, on a whole bunch of different segments in from one state's data. And so what we've done is that for each segment, we kind of normalized its IRI to 100 for the beginning, right after a treatment was done to it. So one line in here means right after this treatment was done, we then track that pavement's performance into the future, okay? We did that for all of them because we wanted to make sure we were capturing performance kind of in a similar time. What you can see is that for a whole bunch of the pavement segments, the data that we're getting from the DOT is that many of them are sort of magically, their performance is getting better. And by the way, this is without any treatments that have been done. And so this says either they are able to magically get better, or there's like some uncertainty or measurement error. And so one of the things that's hard to figure out is what's the signal versus noise when it comes to measuring roughness. And we honestly don't know that. And I think it's something that we need to try to address a bit more when it comes to asset management. So one of the things that we've done in the hub is take a lot of that research we did on pavement vehicle interaction and then put it into an app that you can use on your phone called Carbon, C-A-R-B-I-N. And you can get this in both the Android and Apple App Store. And the way it works is that you mount your phone in your car just as you normally would, on a holder or just on the dashboard or center console. And what it does then, as you drive, it's measuring the vibrations in the vehicle using the accelerometers. Then that data, when you get back from where you're driving, or if you're in a remote place, which I know you can be in North Dakota, it'll transmit it when you get back to Wi-Fi, to servers. Some calculations are done. And then we can then measure what that roughness was and also what the excess fuel consumption was. And this is a way to crowdsource roughness measurements from people's phones. And because of that, we've been able to, track a whole bunch of data. As you can see, across over 150,000 miles in 28 countries and over 10 million data points. And we have it all here on this website where you can play around with it and see what kind of data you have, see what the measurements have shown so far. And I think one of the fascinating parts about this and the way that it can possibly transform asset management is because now, DOTs, it's obviously it's expensive to measure roughness, and oftentimes they're lucky if they can measure roughness once a year. Now we can measure it all the time, whether people are doing it or we've put this technology in concrete mixers so that companies are doing it. It can be put in just about any vehicle that's driven, whether it's using a phone or actually if the vehicle has telematics system. And so there's lots of opportunities to do that. And then hopefully, as you saw, we can use that data to then make better projections about the performance of pavements into the future and get a better understanding of how the network could perform over time. So with that, I will close, and we have a whole bunch more information that's available on our website, and you're more than welcome to follow up, contact us via email, and Art, if there's time, I'd be glad to answer any questions that folks may have.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jeremy. We do have a few questions that did come in.
Great.
During your first part of your presentation, you showed some sections of the U.S. Where you did some different analysis, and you had I believe Colorado was a dry freeze, and different areas. One of the questions is, what would you recommend, or what for North Dakota specifically, what area, what part of the analysis would we fall into there as you divide?
Yeah, exactly. North Dakota is almost certainly a dry freeze as well. Of course, it is kind of in that area right in the middle, but it's basically the more wet freeze is areas in the dry versus wet is purely based on annual precipitation, right? So it's not totally dry in Colorado or Arizona. It just has to do with that annual precipitation level. So I would have to check, but I'm pretty sure that North Dakota would be in that dry freeze, and as we know, it definitely freezes there. So yeah, that would be my likely guess there.
Okay. Another question that came in, and this maybe goes to some of the local politics in North Dakota. One of the biggest complaints is because of our seasonality, a lot of our roads are seasonally restricted, reducing the carrying capacity, and obviously that has impacts to commerce and business. And so, our DOT director has been on record as saying that, the only way to do that, to get rid of them is to build stronger pavements. And obviously, that's going to take a while, but that is a goal of ours. But one of the questions that came in is, how do you think truck weight enforcement, or do you think truck weight enforcement should be part of the equation to help reduce that life cycle cost assessment, due to the fact overloaded trucks, cause an increase, with all the to the
Sure.
deterioration of the pavement. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're doing a life cycle cost analysis, there's some element of trying to predict the future, right? and I don't think that probably anyone doing life cycle cost analyses, 20, 30 years ago would have predicted sort of the energy boom that we've seen in the Midwest, and of course the impact that's had on the vehicles driving on pavements. And so I hesitate to say, we can perfectly predict those things. What I would say is that what's important to do is to account for some level of uncertainty, and that can include the amount of truck traffic you're getting and the weights on those trucks. And the reason that I think that's important is because then it allows you to say, well, kind of like, how robust a design do I have? And I'm using robust there to mean considering that there is uncertainty in the design conditions in this case, how many trucks are going to be driving on the road, and and what's the traffic levels, what's the weight of those trucks, what kind of a design do we have? And so I think that's probably the most important thing to be including in those LCCAs, just explicitly accounting for that uncertainty and then seeing what kind of results that you get. So that would be the biggest thing that I would recommend, is not be afraid of uncertainty, but rather embrace it, and then feel more confident in the results that you get. We see a similar thing when it comes to talking about resilience. And I realize in North Dakota, maybe you're not dealing with as many hurricanes or forest fires, but it's the same concept, right? We don't know exactly what the weather is going to be in the future, but we know that we're going to have, you certainly will see some flooding conditions, right? And so how much flooding is there going to be? We don't know, but we want to have a design that's ready for that. And let's account for the fact that we don't exactly know, and then make sure we're confident in the type of design that we have.
Okay. The follow-up on the road restrictions, since we're still on that, the second part of the question was, how can users be educated on the costs of infrastructure if maybe local officials aren't as keen as enforcing those restrictions and that reduced capacity or the reduced service life? How'd you educate users on what they're really doing to those roadways?
Yeah, I think that's it's a tough question, and a lot of times when it comes to infrastructure, there's a big debate among a lot of people of how much direct-to-consumer marketing should we be doing. But I think that even if we don't have to educate every single person, there will be a significant extent of the population who is interested and will think it's important. For that segment, though, we just have to put it in language that they can understand. And going back to the resilience examples, what we've done when it comes to resilience is try to put it to talk about costs of resilience in the same way that we now have labels on, for example, appliances or vehicles about costs that happen in the future. And so what I mean by that, when it comes to appliances, for example, you don't just know the initial cost of a refrigerator. There's a label on there that tells you how much is this going to cost going in, to operate based on electricity consumption. Similarly, now when you buy a vehicle, it doesn't just say here's the initial cost, here's how much you're going to spend on gas each year. So there are ways, using all the same approaches that I did in this life cycle cost analysis, we can estimate essentially either the user costs associated with a pavement, meaning how much fuel consumption would there be, or traffic delays as well. So how much will people, the taxpayers, pay based on that pavement design? We can absolutely just put that in, sort of dollars per year or dollars for a community. And so I think those are the types of metrics that would be meaningful. They don't even need to know exactly what the pavement design is. You can just say, sort of, here's your default pavement design and how much it will likely cost each person. And then here's a more robust or more resilient design, and here would be the cost to you for that.
Okay, great. We're going to switch gears here. We probably have time for one more question, but as we were preparing for this, I was very happy to see that you put the carbon information in there. I think that's a very valuable resource that your organization has come up with. I certainly try to use it when I'm traveling around North Dakota. I think when I look on the map, I can tell my trips because I'm one of very few users that are using it. So hopefully after today, we can get some more data going into it. But question is, how accurate is carbon? Can you talk a little bit about the accuracy and then maybe expand upon the fact that, your phone or whatever metrics you're using, you want to make sure that you have it really nice and tightly locked into your vehicle for, to help with that accuracy. Maybe dig into that just a little bit more when we have.
I gotta admit, that part of the research isn't my part. I'm more on this economic and environmental aspects, but my colleagues who do it, they knew that people like me were going to be skeptical, and as a consequence, they put a lot of time into demonstrating its accuracy, and I have to say I've been really impressed. And on our website, you can find a lot in that section on carbon. They've done tests on roads where they've compared it specifically with more traditional roughness measurements, and it's really spot on. And what's remarkable to me about that is, as you said, this even accounts for the fact that although you do want to try to keep the phone sort of in one place, it actually doesn't have to be that perfect. Part of the algorithm is figuring out how much of the vibration is probably just due to phone positioning compared to how much is due to what's going on with the vehicle. And of course, the other great thing is that when you're crowdsourcing this data, you don't need any one single drive to be perfect, right? You're trying to get that data from many different people, and that allows you to then get a better sense, like I said before, what's the signal versus what's the noise. So that's the great thing. If you screw up on one drive, you forget, you pick up the phone or whatever, it's not the end of the world, right? Because there's going to be other vehicles that are going through taking that same measurement. But to kind of go back to your original question, it's remarkable to me, really how accurate it's been.
Okay, and again, for those that are on this call and watching, I mean, if you could take a few minutes, download Carbon. It is a very simple app to use as you're traveling across the state, or maybe you have a fleet of vehicles. Educate your drivers and your users to open up that app. If you're limited on data, like as Jeremy said, it will store it, and when you get back to Wi-Fi, it will update. Really great tool, and I would certainly really like to have more of our pavements and routes in North Dakota added to this resource. With that, Dr. Gregory, I think that's all the questions that we will take on the live basis. Certainly, if people have more questions, they can type them in and we will follow up offline. Dr. Gregory, it's always great to have you, and really appreciate the research that you and your team are doing at the CS Hub. Again, for those people that haven't spent time on much time looking for resources, I would encourage you to go to cshub.mit.edu. There is a wealth of information out there, not just on pavements, that's what we're talking about today, but also on concrete structures. Dr. Gregory, once again, thank you for being here this afternoon. Very much enjoyed having you.
It was my pleasure, Art. Thanks very much.
Sounds great.